Hand over the stolen items, thief, or I'll make this a lot worse for you. You really thought nobody would suspect the girl sitting in the corner with that wheelchair?
Officer, I don't know what you are talking about. I haven't stolen anything from anyone.
Officer Trainum leaned down until his face was level with Irene's. His voice dripped with contempt.
Save the act. I've heard better lies from people caught red-handed.
Irene tightened her grip on the armrest, but said nothing. What Trainum didn't know was that accusing Irene was about to become the biggest mistake of his career. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The bell above the door was still swinging when Irene Duskwell guided her wheelchair through the entrance of Millhaven Diner and felt the warmth of the place wrap around her like a familiar blanket. It smelled like burnt coffee and maple syrup in there. Like every Tuesday morning she could remember. She maneuvered between the tables with the ease of someone who had learned long ago how to move through a world that wasn't built for her. Chairs pulled out too far, bags left on the floor, people who stepped back without looking. She navigated all of it without breaking stride, without a word, until she reached the corner booth near the window where the morning light came in yellow and soft. She settled in. On the table in front of her sat three things: a stack of blueberry pancakes still steaming from the kitchen, a mug of orange juice sweating in the warmth, and a letter. The letter. Thick, cream-colored paper with the Langford University seal embossed at the top. She had read it so many times the fold lines were starting to go soft. Dear Ms. Duskwell, we are pleased to offer you admission to the School of Engineering. She had read it in bed the night it arrived. She had read it at the kitchen table while Grandma Violet pressed both hands to her cheeks and cried without making a sound. She had read it again this morning, just to make sure it was still real. It was still real. Across the booth, Dory Finley was already talking. That was the thing about Dory. She arrived talking and stopped only when she slept, and even then Irene wasn't entirely sure. Dory was animated and bright, her natural hair pulled up high, her phone on the table face up the way it always was, already open to three different things at once. I'm just saying, Dory said, stabbing a fork in the direction of Irene's pancakes. Langford's engineering program is top 10 in the country. Top 10. You're going to be designing stuff that changes people's lives, and I'm going to be able to say, I knew you before you were famous. Irene smiled. You're going to take credit for everything, obviously. Violet had gone to the restroom a few minutes before. Irene had watched her go, moving with that straight-backed, unhurried walk she always had, the walk of a woman who had seen enough of the world to stop being in a rush through any part of it. She was 68 years old, and she still walked like she was late to save somebody's life. Irene picked up her fork. Her backpack hung from the handle grip of her wheelchair, right where it always was. Worn canvas, covered in small engineering club patches, stuffed with textbooks and a calculator, and the spare copy of her acceptance letter she carried everywhere because losing the original felt unthinkable. Outside the window, the September morning sat quiet and golden. The bell above the door rang again. She didn't look up right away. There was no reason to. Then she felt it. That particular change in the air that a room makes when something is about to go wrong. A shift, a stillness. She had felt it before, in waiting rooms and grocery stores and school hallways. The feeling of being seen in a way that wasn't friendly. She looked up. Two officers had come through the door. The taller one was broad across the shoulders, with a red, well-fed face and the particular kind of confidence that came not from earning respect, but from never having been denied it. His nameplate read, Tranum. He stood just inside the entrance and scanned the diner the way a man does when he owns the room. Slow, deliberate, ceiling to floor. His eyes landed on Irene. They stopped. Something moved across his face. Not suspicion exactly. Something that wore suspicion like a costume. His partner, younger, thinner, with nervous eyes that kept cutting sideways to watch Trainum for direction, followed 2 steps behind. His nameplate read Hank. Dory had gone quiet. Her fork was still in her hand. Trainum started walking toward the corner booth. He didn't look at the counter, didn't look at the other customers, didn't look at anything except Irene. Thomas Wren, the diner's owner, stood behind the counter with a dish towel in both hands and watched them come. He did not move. He did not say a single word. Tranum reached the table and stopped. He looked down at Irene the way people look at something they've already decided isn't worth much. "Got a call," he said. "Theft in progress, store 2 blocks over." He tilted his head slowly toward her wheelchair. "Someone matching your description walked out with a bag." The words landed in the quiet diner like something dropped from a great height. Irene looked at him steadily. "That wasn't me." "That's so." It wasn't a question. He said it the way people say things they don't believe and want you to know they don't believe. His eyes moved to the backpack hanging from her wheelchair handle. He nodded at it. "Open it." The morning light was still coming through the window. The pancakes were still warm. The letter was still sitting on the table. Everything was about to change. Irene didn't move. Not right away. She sat very still in her wheelchair and looked up at Officer Trainum. And the look on her face was not fear. It was the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that showing the wrong thing at the wrong moment cost you more than silence did. "Open it," Trainum said again. Slower this time, like she hadn't understood him the first time. "You have a report number?" Irene asked. "For this call?" Something shifted in Trainum's expression. A flicker of irritation, quick as a match strike, there and gone. He wasn't used to questions. That much was clear. "I'm not here to answer your questions," he said. "I'm asking you to open the bag." "You're asking me to open my personal property," Irene said, "based on a call you haven't described, with no report number and no description of what was actually stolen." She kept her voice even, measured, like she was reading from a textbook. "I'd like to know what was taken, from which store." "And when?" Hank shifted his weight behind Trainum. He looked uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable enough to say anything, but uncomfortable enough that Irene noticed it, and filed it away. Trainum leaned forward and placed both hands flat on the table. He got close. Close enough that Irene could smell the coffee on his breath. Close enough that the message was unmistakable. "I am bigger than you. I am above you. And you will do what I say. Open." "The bag," he said, "or we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." The diner had gone completely silent. Every customer at every table had stopped eating. 2 women near the window were watching with wide eyes, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. A man in a baseball cap stared down at his plate like it might protect him. Behind the counter, Thomas Wren had stopped pretending to wipe things down. He just stood there, dish towel limp in his hands, watching. Nobody said a word. Dory said, "I'm recording this." Her phone was up, face out, camera running. She hadn't hidden it. She held it openly, aimed squarely at Trainum's face, and her hand was steady even though the rest of her was vibrating with fury. Trainum turned to look at her. Something cold moved into his eyes. "Put that away," he said. I have a legal right to film a police interaction in a public space, Dory said. Her voice was shaking, but her hand wasn't. So no. For just a moment, nobody moved. Then Trainum reached out and snatched the phone directly out of Dory's hand. Dory jerked back like she'd been burned. Hey, that is my property. You'll get it back, Trainum said flatly, and slid the phone into his shirt pocket like it was nothing. Like it meant nothing. Like Dory meant nothing. Irene's jaw tightened. Confiscating her phone is illegal, she said. Her voice had changed. Still controlled, but there was an edge in it now, clean and sharp as a blade. You know that. You are standing here knowing that, and you're doing it anyway. Trainum looked back at her. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had done this before and faced nothing for it. He leaned down until his face was level with hers, close enough that it was a violation all on its own, and he lowered his voice so that only Irene could hear what he said next. Who, he said quietly, is going to believe you, sweetheart? He let that sit in the air between them for 3 full seconds. Then he straightened up, tugged his belt, and nodded at her backpack again. Irene looked at him. She looked at the phone-shaped bulge in his shirt pocket. She looked at Hank, who was staring at the floor. She looked at Thomas Wren, who looked away the moment her eyes found his. Then she reached down, unzipped her backpack, and placed it open on the table. Inside, 3 engineering textbooks. A Texas Instruments calculator, the same one she'd had since 9th grade, the plastic cracked along one corner. A pencil case, a water bottle, and her acceptance letter. The spare copy, folded twice, tucked into the front pocket where she always kept it. Trainum reached in without asking. He picked up each textbook and turned it over like he expected something to fall out. He picked up the calculator, set it down. He pulled out the acceptance letter, unfolded it slowly, and read it. His expression didn't change. He folded it back up. He dropped it on the table. He didn't put it back in the bag. He just dropped it, carelessly, like it was junk mail. Satisfied? Irene said. Trainum said nothing. He looked at her one more time, long, deliberate, making sure she felt it, then turned and walked toward the door. Hank followed without looking back. The bell rang once as the door swung shut behind them. The diner stayed silent. Irene reached out and picked up the acceptance letter. She smoothed it carefully against the table with both hands, pressing out the new crease Trainum's grip had made. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the letter until they stopped. The bathroom door opened. Violet Duskwell walked out the same way she always walked, straight back, chin level, unhurried, and crossed the diner floor toward the corner booth. She took in the scene in the time it took her to cover 10 feet. Irene's face, Dory's empty hands, the acceptance letter lying on the table with a fresh crease down the middle, the silence of a room full of people who had just watched something happen and done nothing about it. She sat down. She didn't gasp, didn't raise her voice, didn't reach across the table to grip Irene's hand the way some grandmothers might have. She simply sat down, folded her hands in front of her, and looked at her granddaughter with eyes that had seen enough hard things to know that falling apart in the middle of them helped nobody. "Tell me," she said. Irene told her, quietly, precisely, in the same measured tone she'd used with Trainum. Dory filled in the gaps, voice still vibrating. When they finished, Violet sat with it for a moment. Just a moment. Then she said, "Badge numbers." "Trainum and Hank," Irene said. "I didn't get the numbers, but I saw the nameplates clearly." Violet nodded once. She reached into her purse and took out her phone. It was an older model, nothing fancy, the kind of phone that belonged to someone who used it as a tool rather than an accessory. She opened her contacts. She scrolled. Irene watched her scroll past name after name. Dozens of them, maybe more. And something about the length of that list, the sheer number of people Violet apparently knew well enough to store and keep, made Dory lean over slightly to look. Violet stopped scrolling. She pressed a name and stood up from the booth, stepping away from the table toward the quieter end of the diner near the coat rack. She turned her back to the room, brought the phone to her ear, and waited. Someone answered on the second ring. Violet spoke quietly, not whispering. Violet Duskwell was not a woman who whispered, but low and deliberate, in the focused way of someone delivering a report rather than telling a story. Irene caught pieces of it from across the diner. Grover Falls, pattern of conduct, federal compliance question, words that sounded official, clinical, words that didn't belong in a Tuesday morning diner over blueberry pancakes. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Violet came back to the table and sat down, something had shifted in the way she held herself. She looked almost, and this was the part that unsettled Irene, because she had never seen it before. She looked almost sorry for Trainum. Not in a soft way. In the specific, quiet way you feel sorry for a man who has just done something that cannot be undone and doesn't know it yet. "Grandma," Irene said carefully, "who did you call?" Violet picked up her coffee cup. "Sasha." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Dory looked between them. "Who's Sasha?" Irene stared at her grandmother. "You didn't." "I did." "Grandma." She needed to know. Violet took a calm sip of her coffee. She's been waiting for a reason to look at that department for 2 years. Now she has one. Dory was still looking back and forth between them. "Can somebody please tell me who Sasha is?" Violet set down her cup. "Major General Sasha Tolbert," she said, in the same tone someone might use to say the weather is nice today. "Pentagon. Office of Inspector General." Silence. "She oversees federal and military law enforcement conduct reviews," Violet continued. "Among other things." She smoothed her napkin in her lap. "Sasha and I served together for 6 years. She was my commanding officer during a classified forward operation overseas. We have stayed in close contact for 40 years. A small pause. "She is not a woman who moves slowly when she has cause to move." Dory sat back in her seat. "Miss Violet," she said slowly, "you called the Pentagon." "I called an old friend," Violet said simply. "She happens to work there." Thomas Wren appeared at the edge of the table, dish towel still in hand, face arranged into the expression of a man attempting an apology without quite committing to one. He stammered something about being sorry, about not wanting trouble, about hoping the girls were okay. Irene looked at him. She thought about the way he had stood behind that counter and watched everything happen without making a single sound. "Thank you, Mr. Wren," she said politely. It was not forgiveness. It was a door closing. Outside, the morning had shifted. The light through the window was brighter now, higher, the kind of mid-morning light that made everything look clean and ordinary. Trainum's cruiser was long gone from the parking lot. He was out there somewhere, probably already on another call, already forgetting about the girl in the wheelchair and her ruined acceptance letter. Violet watched her granddaughter's face and said nothing more. She didn't need to. The call had been made. That evening, Irene sat alone at Violet's kitchen table. The house was quiet. Violet had gone to bed an hour ago, after making sure Irene had eaten something real. Not just the pancakes she'd barely touched at the diner, but actual food. A bowl of rice and beans with hot sauce the way Irene liked it. She had set the bowl down without comment and gone upstairs without making a production of it. That was Violet's way. She fed you, and she trusted you, and she left you alone to think. Irene was thinking. The acceptance letter sat on the table in front of her. Both copies now. The original with its soft fold lines and the spare with Trainum's new crease running down the center. She had smoothed that crease out as best she could, but the paper remembered. It always remembered. She picked up her phone. She looked at the two letters for a long moment. Then she opened her camera, held it above the table, and photographed both of them side by side. The thick cream paper, the Langford seal, the soft crumple of something handled too many times and once handled by entirely the wrong person. She opened her social media app, typed a caption. They ruined the paper. Not the offer. Not me. She posted it and set the phone face down on the table. She went to bed. She woke at 6 in the morning to a phone that would not stop vibrating. By the time she picked it up, the post had 40,000 shares. By the time she brushed her teeth, it was 80,000. By the time she came downstairs and found Violet already at the stove making coffee, the number had crossed 200,000 and was still climbing. Violet looked at her over one shoulder. "Your phone has been going since 5. "I know." "Sit down." Irene sat. Violet set a mug of coffee in front of her and sat across the table, and together they read through what was happening on the screen. Local news outlets had picked up the story overnight. 3 different journalists had already sent interview requests. A community Facebook group in Grover Falls had a thread with over 400 comments, most of them angry, most of them saying some version of this is not the first time. What none of them knew yet, what Irene only found out when Dory called at 7:30, voice somewhere between laughing and crying, was that Dory's phone had been backing up to cloud storage the entire time. Every second of footage, from the moment Trainum approached the table to the moment he dropped the acceptance letter and walked away, had uploaded automatically before he ever pulled the phone from Dory's hand. The full video was already online. Dory had posted it at midnight. Irene watched it sitting at the kitchen table. Violet watched it beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment after it ended. He knew exactly what he was doing, Dory said through the phone. Every single second. By afternoon, the story had gone national. Councilwoman Faye Birchwood held a brief press appearance outside City Hall, standing very straight in a blue blazer, using words like unacceptable and deeply troubling, and our community deserves better. She looked directly into the camera when she said them. She looked like a woman who had checked which way the wind was blowing before she stepped outside. 2 hours later, Chief Vincent Orchard held his own press conference. Irene watched it on Violet's living room television. Orchard was a large man, silver-haired, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. He stood at a podium with the Grover Falls Police Department seal behind him and looked into the cameras with an expression of careful, calibrated concern. He spoke about the department's commitment to the community. He spoke about thorough reviews. He used the word isolated twice in 4 sentences. He announced that Officers Tranum and Hank had been placed on paid administrative leave, effective immediately, pending internal review. The room the press conference was being held in murmured. A few reporters raised hands. Orchard took 2 questions, answered neither of them fully, and stepped away from the podium with the smooth efficiency of a man who had already decided how much he was willing to give. Irene watched his eyes the entire time. They were calm, controlled, the eyes of a man who was not worried. She turned to Violet. "He's used that word before," she said. "Isolated." Violet was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and turned off the television. "Yes," she said simply. "He has." The call from Clifford Nelson came 2 days after the press conference. Irene was at her desk when her phone rang. An unknown Columbus number, professional and unhesitating on the other end. Nelson introduced himself in the direct, no-wasted-words way of someone who respected other people's time because he had none to spare. Civil rights attorney, 14 years of practice. He had seen the video. He had followed the story. He was offering full pro bono representation, and he wanted to meet as soon as possible. Irene looked at the acceptance letter on her desk. "When?" she said. The drive to Columbus took just under 2 hours. Violet drove. Irene sat in the passenger seat watching the flat Ohio landscape roll past the window. Cornfields giving way to highway exits, giving way to the outer edge of the city, and said almost nothing the entire way. Violet didn't push. She kept both hands on the wheel and let the miles pass. Nelson's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building downtown, clean and purposeful. The kind of space that said serious work happens here without needing to announce it. He met them at the door himself. A tall man in his late 40s, dark suit, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook Violet's hand first, then Irene's, and looked at her with the direct, evaluating attention of someone who was already thinking 3 steps ahead. They sat down across from his desk. He didn't ease into it. "I'm going to tell you things that are going to be hard to hear," he said. "I'd rather you hear them from me now than discover them later when it costs us more. Is that all right?" Irene nodded. He opened a folder. Tranum had 3 prior complaints filed against him over 14 years on the force. One involved a black veteran who used a prosthetic leg, stopped in a parking lot under nearly identical circumstances to Irene's. All 3 complaints had been buried. Not lost, not mishandled. Buried deliberately, with Chief Vincent Orchard's knowledge and involvement in each case. The police union contract with the city of Grover Falls made termination without a criminal conviction nearly impossible, regardless of complaint history. Tranum knew this. Orchard knew this. Their attorney had already begun constructing a narrative that Irene and Dory had deliberately engineered the encounter for social media attention. Irene sat very still through all of it. Violet sat beside her, hands folded, face unreadable. "There's one more thing," Nelson said. He paused, just briefly. Grover Falls PD receives a significant portion of its city operating budget through a federal law enforcement grant program. That program requires annual compliance certification, specifically regarding ADA Title II and unresolved civil rights complaints. He looked at Violet. That certification falls under the oversight of an agency connected to the Pentagon Inspector General's office. Violet met his gaze and said nothing. "Your call to General Tolbert," Nelson said carefully, "was not a symbolic gesture. If Tolbert's inquiry finds a systemic pattern of civil rights violations in Grover Falls, the city could lose millions in federal funding." He closed the folder. "That is why Chief Orchard is going to want this story to go away. Quietly, quickly, and completely." They drove home, mostly in silence. Irene stared out the passenger window and watched the city dissolve back into highway. Highway back into flat land. Flat land back into the familiar streets of Grover Falls. She was processing, filing. The way she did with complex engineering problems, not panicking, just sorting, looking for the structure underneath. She was still sorting when they pulled into Violet's driveway. The mailbox flag was up. Violet got it, while Irene wheeled up the ramp to the front door. She brought the mail inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stopped. Near the bottom of the small stack was a business envelope. Langford University return address. Irene's name in the window. She opened it, standing at the table. She read it once. Then she read it again. Her acceptance had been administratively reconsidered, pending a routine background review that had raised unspecified concerns. The language was careful and bloodless, and said absolutely nothing specific, because there was nothing specific to say. Irene Duskwell had never received a detention. She had never been in trouble of any kind. There was no background review process at Langford that could legitimately flag anything about her. The message was not in the words. The message was the letter. Someone had made a phone call. Someone had applied pressure. And now Langford was pulling her future off the table like a plate being cleared before she'd finished eating. Irene set the letter down beside the original acceptance letter. The coffee-stained one. The creased one. She looked at Violet. "They think this scares me," she said. Violet watched her steadily. "Does it?" The kitchen was very quiet. "It makes me certain," Irene said. 1 week after the Langford letter arrived, Clifford Nelson filed. Irene, Violet, and Dory sat in his Columbus office on a gray October morning and watched him sign the last page of a federal civil rights complaint that ran to 41 pages. He signed it the way he did everything, without ceremony, without drama, like it was simply the next necessary thing. Then he slid it across the desk so Irene could read the title block. United States District Court, Northern District of Ohio, Irene Duskwell versus City of Grover Falls, et al. Dory exhaled slowly beside her. Violet sat with her hands folded and her chin level, the way she always sat when she was paying close attention to everything and showing nothing. Irene read the title block twice. Then she looked up at Nelson. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," he said. "They fight back." He was right. They didn't wait. Within 72 hours, the city's legal team filed a motion to dismiss the complaint on procedural grounds, arguing that the federal court lacked jurisdiction over what they called a routine municipal employment matter. The language was dense and technical, and designed to sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know better. Nelson had expected it. He had already drafted the response before their motion landed on his desk. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the speed of the second move. The city's attorneys filed a subpoena for Dory's complete phone records. Not just the footage from the diner, but everything. Every text message. Every social media direct message. Every search. Months of it. They were building a narrative, Nelson explained when he called Irene that evening, that the two girls had planned the encounter deliberately, that they had identified Trainum in advance, that the whole thing was a staged performance for online attention. Irene sat at the kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear and listened to this without speaking. "They're going to try to make you the story," Nelson said. "Instead of him." "I know," she said. "It's going to get ugly." "I know that, too." The ugliest part came from a direction she hadn't expected. City investigators began quietly contacting everyone who had been inside Millhaven Diner that morning. The two women by the window, the man in the baseball cap, the waitress who had refilled their orange juice without making eye contact with anyone. One by one, those witnesses either stopped returning calls or gave statements so vague they were functionally useless. And then came Thomas Wren. Nelson called on a Thursday afternoon, and something in the flatness of his voice told Irene, before he said a word, that the news was not good. Wren had issued a public statement. Irene pulled it up on her phone while Nelson was still talking. It was short, carefully worded. It said that Thomas Wren had been present during the incident in question and that, upon reflection, he did not witness any misconduct by the responding officers. It said he had full confidence in the Grover Falls Police Department. It thanked the department for its continued service to the community. Irene read it twice. A hot, tight feeling moved through her chest. She was sitting in Nelson's office for a follow-up meeting when she read it. She had driven up that morning with Violet. She set her phone face down on the edge of his desk. She picked up her notebook and her pen. She wrote Thomas Wren's name in the margin of a blank page. She underlined it once. Then she set the pen down and did not speak about it again. By the end of that same week, Councilwoman Fay Birchwood had gone quiet. Not officially. She hadn't issued any statement withdrawing her support. She had simply stopped. Stopped returning Nelson's calls. Stopped posting about the case. Stopped using words like unacceptable and deeply troubling. Her office, when contacted by a local reporter, said only that the councilwoman believed in allowing due process to proceed without political interference. Irene read that quote on her phone in bed that night. She thought about the blue blazer, the careful eye contact with the camera, the way Birchwood had stood outside City Hall and made the word community sound like something she owned. She put her phone down and stared at the ceiling. Nelson had told her that morning that Major General Tolbert's Pentagon inquiry was active and progressing, but that federal processes were methodical and slow by design. Tolbert had sent word through Violet. "I have what I need. Tell Irene to hold." Holding felt like standing still while the ground moved under her feet. She closed her eyes. She held. The message came through Nelson's office on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks into the legal battle. It was brief. No explanation, no context, just a name and a phone number, and 4 words written beneath them in plain, careful handwriting on a single sheet of paper that had been hand-delivered by a woman who told the receptionist only that it was important. The note read, "I have a name for you." The name at the top was Sergeant Yvonne Quill, Grover Falls Internal Affairs. Nelson called Irene before he called anyone else. They met Quill 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, at a coffee shop 40 minutes outside Grover Falls. Neutral ground. Her choice. She arrived before any of them, already seated at a corner table with her back to the wall and a clear view of the door. The habit of someone who had spent 2 decades in law enforcement and trusted almost nobody inside it. She was in her mid-50s, compact and precise, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of still, watchful eyes that didn't miss much and gave away nothing. She was in civilian clothes. She shook Nelson's hand, then Irene's, and when she looked at Irene, there was something in her expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration, but sat somewhere between them. "I can't be a formal source," she said, before anyone had spoken beyond introductions. "Not yet. What I give you today is for your investigation, not for court. When the time is right, we'll talk about what I can do officially." She looked at Nelson. "Understood?" "Understood," he said. She reached into her bag and placed a single folded sheet of paper on the table. On it was a name, an address, and a brief handwritten summary. 3 sentences. "Her name is Lucia Vash," Quill said. 71 years old. Retired school teacher. She uses a motorized scooter." She paused. 3 years ago, Officer Trainum approached her in the parking lot of a grocery store on Millhaven Road. He told her the scooter was blocking a fire lane. It wasn't. He demanded her identification. He accused her of trespassing on private property. He followed her to her car. Another pause. She filed a formal complaint the following Monday. Nelson looked up from the paper. What happened to it? Quill's jaw tightened slightly. Chief Orchard signed the destruction order personally. The complaint documentation no longer exists in any official system. She folded her hands on the table. I kept a copy. The coffee shop was warm and ordinary around them. A couple sharing a newspaper nearby, a barista calling out orders, the soft sound of a morning that had no idea what was being said at the corner table. Irene sat very still and listened. How many others? Nelson asked. That I can document? Quill thought for a moment. 4 more. All within Trainum's 14 years on the force. All buried. All involving either disabled individuals, elderly people of color, or both. She looked at Irene directly. He doesn't do this randomly. He selects people he believes won't be taken seriously. People he thinks the system won't listen to. A beat. He's been right, up until now. Nelson found Lucia Vash that same afternoon. She lived in a small, tidy house on the east side of Grover Falls, the kind of house where everything was in its place, and the front porch had flowers even in October. She answered the door on the first knock, like she had been expecting someone eventually, and looked at Nelson and Irene with the careful, measuring look of a woman who had been disappointed before and was deciding whether to risk it again. Nelson explained who they were and why they had come. Lucia was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and said, "You'd better come in." She told her story at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, in the steady, unhurried voice of someone who had rehearsed it in their own head many times, without ever expecting to say it out loud to anyone who mattered. She remembered every detail, the date, the time, the exact words Tranum had used, the way he had smiled when she'd told him she was going to report him. "Go ahead," he had said. "See what happens." When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Irene looked at her across the table. Lucia looked back. "I never thought anyone would listen," Lucia said. Irene held her gaze. "We're listening now," she said. That evening, back in Columbus, Nelson amended the federal complaint. He added a systemic pattern of conduct claim. He named Chief Vincent Orchard as a personal defendant. The case had just gotten considerably larger and considerably harder to bury. The next morning, Irene sat alone at her desk. It was early. The kind of early where the house made small sounds, the furnace cycling on, the refrigerator humming downstairs, the particular creak of the third step that Violet always hit on her way to the kitchen. The sky outside Irene's window was the color of cold ash, not yet committed to becoming day. Her engineering textbooks were open on the desk in front of her. 3 of them, arranged the way she always arranged them. Largest on the left, smallest on the right, a system she had invented in 9th grade and never changed. Her pencils were sharpened. Her notebook was open to a fresh page. She hadn't written anything in it. She hadn't written anything in 3 days. The project had started 2 years ago, in the quiet months after her diagnosis had been confirmed, and the reality of what her life was going to look like had settled into something she could finally examine without flinching. She called it the Meridian, a lightweight motorized attachment, compact enough to fit in a standard backpack, designed to clip onto the frame of any manual wheelchair and convert it to powered operation in under 90 seconds. The kind of device that cost $4,000 when manufactured by the companies that made them. The kind of device that Violet had spent 6 months researching second-hand options for before they found one that was barely functional and cost more than they could comfortably afford. Irene wanted to build it for $200. She wanted to build it for the girl who was going to be diagnosed next year, in some other city, in some other house, whose grandmother was also going to spend months on the phone with insurance companies and equipment suppliers and charitable foundations and come up against the same walls Violet had come up against. She wanted to build it because she knew exactly what it felt like to need something and be told in 100 different quiet ways that people like her weren't really the target market. Langford's engineering program had a fabrication lab, 3 materials science professors whose research focused on accessible design, and a partnership with a medical device company that funded student prototypes. It was not just the next step in her education. It was the specific door she needed to walk through to build the specific thing she was trying to build. She stared at the blank notebook page. Downstairs, she could hear Violet moving through her morning, the sound of the kettle, the soft thud of cabinet doors, the particular rhythm of a woman who had maintained the same morning routine for 40 years, regardless of what was happening around her. There was something steadying about that sound. Irene had always found it steadying. She thought about the 2 jobs, the early shifts and the late ones, the years of careful saving, the way Violet had handed her that first acceptance letter and said, "I knew," not "I hoped," not "I thought maybe," but "I knew." Like it was simply a fact she had been waiting for the world to catch up to. The guilt sat in her chest, like a stone. She picked up her phone. She scrolled back to the original post, the coffee-stained letters, the caption, and read through the comments the way she had been doing every few days since it went up. Not the threats, not the hostile ones, the other ones. "This happened to my son. He's 23, and in a chair, and they treated him like a criminal for existing in a parking lot. Thank you for not staying quiet. I'm 67 years old, and I've been saying for 20 years that this happens. Nobody listened. They're listening now. My daughter has cerebral palsy. She's 12. I read her your caption this morning. She cried. I cried. Please, keep going." Irene read them slowly, all the way down, hundreds of them, stretching back weeks. She set the phone face down on the desk. She already knew about the photograph. Nelson had sent it to her the day before without comment, just the image attached to a text message. Tranum and Hank, out of uniform, seated across a table from Chief Vincent Orchard, outside a restaurant near City Hall. All 3 of them laughing. Orchard's hand on Tranum's shoulder. The easy body language of men who believed themselves untouchable. Photographed mid-sentence in the middle of an ordinary lunch. Someone had posted it to a local social media page with the caption, "Nothing to see here." Irene had looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she had put her phone down and picked up her pencil. She began with the frame, the base plate, the attachment mechanism. Slow at first, the lines uncertain, then steadier, then faster. The notebook page filled, then the next one, then the next. She drew until her hand ached, and the sky outside her window had gone fully dark. She was still building. They had not stopped her yet. 1 week later, they drove to Columbus in the dark. Violet had the car running at 5:30 in the morning, the headlights cutting through the flat Ohio pre-dawn, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and nothing on the radio. Irene sat in the passenger seat with her notebook in her lap and her eyes forward. Dory was in the back, unusually quiet, her phone face down on the seat beside her. Lucia Vash followed in her own car, driving herself the way she insisted on doing everything, without assistance, without fuss. Nobody talked much on the drive. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. The federal courthouse in Columbus was a tall, serious building with wide stone steps and the particular cold authority of a place where important things were decided. Irene had never been inside a federal courthouse before. She wheeled through the main entrance and felt the weight of the building settle around her. The high ceilings, the marble floors, the echo of footsteps that sounded deliberate even when they weren't. The gallery filled quickly. Community members from Grover Falls had driven up. Some of them faces Irene recognized from the comment section of her post, now made suddenly real, standing in a courthouse hallway in their good coats. Disability rights advocates. 2 journalists with notepads. A woman who introduced herself as Lucia's daughter and pressed Lucia's hand for a long moment before the doors opened. Outside, on the courthouse steps, a group of supporters gathered in the cold with hand-lettered signs. They couldn't come in. They came anyway. Judge Harriet Folsom entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, and the room rose. She was a small woman in her early 60s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the practiced efficiency of someone who had heard a great many arguments and developed a finely calibrated detector for the ones wasting her time. She settled into her seat, opened the file in front of her, and looked out at the courtroom with an expression that said, clearly and without words, that she expected the morning to be productive. Nelson stood up. He was precise. He was calm. He laid the case out in clean, ordered sections, the diner incident first, the video evidence presented in full with the courtroom's audio system carrying every word Trainum had said in that corner booth. Irene sat at the plaintiff's table and listened to her own voice on the recording, steady and careful, and then Trainum's voice underneath it, low and amused, and entirely certain he was speaking to someone without recourse. "Who's going to believe you, sweetheart?" The courtroom was very quiet when that part played. Judge Folsom's expression did not change, but she wrote something down. Lucia Vash testified next. She sat in the witness box in her good blue dress and told her story, the same way she had told it at her kitchen table. Every detail intact, her voice level, her hands still in her lap. She described the parking lot, the accusations, the complaint she had filed, and what had happened to it. When Nelson asked her directly whether she believed Trainum had targeted her because of her disability and her race, she looked at the judge rather than the attorney and said, "I know he did, and I know I wasn't the first." The city's defense team stood and objected. Judge Folsom sustained it on technical grounds, but the words were already in the room, already in every ear, already written on every notepad in the press row. Nelson then presented the pattern documentation, the 5 buried complaints, the signed destruction orders, the systemic evidence that Sergeant Quill's private file had provided. He did not name Quill as his source. He presented the documents themselves, authenticated through federal discovery processes that had moved with unusual speed once the DOJ had taken an interest in the case. The city's defense lead stood to deliver his argument. He was a polished man in a gray suit who spoke with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to making unreasonable things sound reasonable. He described the diner encounter as officers responding in good faith to a reported theft. He described the pattern evidence as isolated incidents, mischaracterized as systemic. He used the word context 11 times. Judge Folsom let him finish. Then she looked down at the motion to dismiss and denied it. She did not do it quietly. She said, in measured, deliberate language that filled the courtroom from wall to wall, that she did not find the plaintiff's claims frivolous. She found the city's defense of them to be. Outside the courthouse, the supporters on the steps erupted. Irene came through the doors into the cold afternoon air and stopped at the top of the steps. The crowd below her was loud and warm and real. Cameras, microphones, faces she knew and faces she didn't. Violet stood beside her, straight-backed, military still. Irene looked out at all of it and felt, for the first time in weeks, the ground beneath her holding firm. That night, Violet made dinner. They ate together at the kitchen table. Just the two of them, quiet and easy. The kind of meal that doesn't need conversation to mean something. Irene allowed herself, just this once, to think it might nearly be over. She was wrong. The call came 48 hours after the hearing. Irene was at her desk, sketchbook open, working on the Meridian's attachment mechanism when her phone buzzed with Nelson's name. She picked up on the second ring. His voice was different from the voice he'd used on the courthouse steps 2 days ago. That voice had carried something close to triumph. This one was stripped clean of everything except the facts. The police union filed an emergency injunction this morning, he said. State court. They got Judge Randy Casper. Irene set down her pencil. What does that mean? It means they went to a state court judge with documented ties to the union's political donors and asked him to freeze all disciplinary action against Tranum and Hank pending a full state court review. A pause. He granted it. Temporary restraining order. Effective immediately. The room felt suddenly very still. How long? Irene asked. The review could take 18 months. She sat with that number for a moment. 18 months. Long enough for the news cycle to move through several complete rotations. Long enough for witnesses to grow tired. Long enough for community outrage to cool into resignation. Long enough for Tranum and Hank to simply wait it out, drawing their salaries, their lives entirely unchanged while the machinery ground slowly forward. That was the point. She understood it immediately. The way you understand something that is designed to be understood. A message delivered in the language of legal procedure. We can outlast you. Is there anything we can do about the TRO? She asked. We challenge it in state court, which takes time. We argue federal preemption, which also takes time. Nelson's voice was steady, professional, giving her the information without the panic. They knew exactly what they were doing. The federal case is still active. The TRO can't touch that. But the employment actions, the terminations, the disciplinary process, all of it is frozen until the state court moves. After she hung up, Irene sat at her desk for a long time without moving. The second blow landed 3 days later. It came from everywhere at once, the way coordinated things do. Too simultaneous to be coincidental, too organized to be organic. A local conservative radio host led with it on his morning show. 3 regional news websites ran variations of the same story within hours of each other. A nationally syndicated commentator picked it up by afternoon. The story, in all its versions, said the same thing. Irene Duskwell and Dory Finley had planned the diner encounter in advance. They had identified Tranum specifically. They had staged the confrontation for social media content, deliberately provoking officers to generate viral footage. The backpack, the acceptance letter, the celebration, all of it choreographed. The sources were anonymous in every story. Every single one. Irene's phone filled with things she stopped reading after the first hour. Dory called her twice, and Irene could hear in Dory's voice the specific kind of shock that comes from discovering that a lie, told loudly enough and in enough places simultaneously, starts to sound like it might be true to people who weren't there. "They're calling us liars," Dory said. "On national radio. Just flat out calling us liars." "I know," Irene said. "Irene, I know." Her voice was quiet but solid. "Keep your receipts. Save everything. Don't respond to any of it." That same week, Langford University issued a new statement. Brief, bloodless. It confirmed that Irene's rescission remained under internal review and that the university anticipated no resolution in the near term. No timeline, no commitment, no acknowledgement of anything that had happened in a Columbus federal courtroom 6 days earlier. Irene read it standing at the kitchen counter and set her phone face down without a word. Nelson's office was quiet that evening when they met. The kind of quiet that offices get after hours, when the phones stop and the building empties, and all that's left is the work itself. He didn't soften it. That was one of the things about Nelson. He understood that honesty, delivered carefully, was a form of respect. "They outmaneuvered us," he said. "The TRO was a strategic move we didn't anticipate. Its purpose isn't to win in state court. It's to create delay. Delay creates fatigue. Fatigue creates retreat." He looked at Irene directly. "They're not trying to beat you. They're trying to exhaust you." Irene looked back at him without blinking. "Then they picked the wrong person," she said. She meant it. She was certain she meant it. But sitting in the passenger seat on the drive home, watching Grover Falls reassemble itself in the dark outside the window, she felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders like something physical. The TRO, the media campaign, Langford's silence, Wren's reversal, Birchwood's disappearance. One by one, the things she had believed were solid had turned out to be temporary. She didn't cry. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and breathed. Violet drove. That night, after Irene had gone upstairs, Violet sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. She scrolled to a name she had called once before. She pressed it. This call was different from the first one. She had something new. Something she had been holding for 40 years without knowing exactly when she would need it. She knew now. "Sasha," she said, when the line connected. "I need to send you something." 3 weeks after the TRO, Irene couldn't sleep. She had stopped trying around 2 in the morning, when lying in the dark stopped feeling like rest and started feeling like something closer to surrender. She had transferred herself into her wheelchair with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, pulled on a sweatshirt, and wheeled herself downstairs without turning on any lights. She knew the layout of Violet's house the way she knew her own hands. Every doorframe, every threshold, every place where the floor transitioned and she needed to adjust. She settled at the kitchen table. Her sketchbooks were there, the way they always were, stacked at the corner of the table where she left them. She opened the top one. The Meridian sketches filled the first 30 pages. Frame dimensions, attachment tolerances, motor housing designs, notes in the margins in her small, precise handwriting. Good work. Real work. The kind of work that had a shape and a direction and a purpose she could hold on to. She stared at the open page. She picked up her pencil. She put it back down. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was the deep blue-gray of the hour before dawn. Not dark enough to be night, not light enough to be morning. Grover Falls was completely still. No cars, no voices. Just the furnace cycling on and off, and the occasional creak of the house settling around her. The acceptance letter was on the counter in its frame, still unhung. She had moved it there from her bedroom 3 days ago, because looking at it from her bed had started to feel like a taunt. Now it faced her from the counter instead, the Langford seal visible even in the low light. And somehow that was worse. She heard the third step creak. Violet appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe and slippers, silver hair loose around her shoulders, moving with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had woken at irregular hours her entire adult life, and made her peace with it long ago. She looked at Irene. She looked at the untouched sketchbook. She crossed to the stove without a word, and put the kettle on. She made 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Irene, sat down across the table. Neither of them spoke for a while. The furnace clicked off. The house went very quiet. Outside, the sky shifted almost imperceptibly, the darkness thinning at its edges, the first suggestion of gray. Finally, Irene said it. The thing she had been carrying for 3 weeks, turning over in the dark, examining from every angle. "I keep thinking," she said, "what if I'd just moved along?" She wasn't asking. She was stating the weight of it. What if I'd just let him look through the bag and walk away and not said a word? Dory wouldn't have filmed it. Nobody would have. It would have just been a bad morning. We would have gone home. Violet wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked at her granddaughter across the table and was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandfather asked me something like that once," she said, "night before I shipped out the first time. He sat across from me, right across, the way I'm sitting now, and he said, 'Ruth, what if you just stay home? What if somebody else goes?'" Irene looked at her. "And I told him," Violet continued, her voice even and unhurried, "that if I stayed home when they needed nurses, I was making a decision. Not a passive one, an active one. I was deciding that the men over there weren't worth the cost to me personally." She paused. "That's always the real question. Not can I fight this, not will I win. Just, are those people worth it?" She looked at Irene steadily. Lucia Vash, the veteran with the complaint that got buried, the ones who filed and got nowhere and went home believing nobody would ever listen. A beat. Are they worth it to you? The kitchen was very quiet. Irene stared at the table, at her hands, at the pencil lying beside the sketchbook. "You can decide this fight isn't worth finishing," Violet said. "That's a real choice. I would understand it. But you can't make it because you're afraid. You can only make it because you're genuinely done." She picked up her coffee. "So I'm asking, are you done?" The sky outside the window had shifted again. Lighter now. The gray was warmer, the darkness retreating from the edges, the first pale line of morning appearing at the horizon. Irene picked up her pencil. She opened the sketchbook to a fresh page. She began to draw. Violet watched her for a moment. Then she stood, refilled both their coffees without being asked, and sat back down. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The call from Nelson came the following week, on a Tuesday afternoon. Irene was in the middle of a meridian calculation, torque ratios for the motor housing, numbers she had been working through for 2 days, when her phone buzzed on the desk beside her sketchbook. She picked it up without looking away from the page. Then she heard his voice and looked up. In 4 months of working together, Clifford Nelson had maintained the same professional composure through every setback, every ambush, every procedural maneuver the city's legal team had thrown at them. His voice had been steady through the TRO, steady through the media campaign, steady through Wren's reversal, and Birchwood's silence, and Langford's bloodless non-answers. It was not entirely steady now, not panicked, not loud, but there was something moving underneath it, A kind of barely contained disbelief, the sound of a man looking at something he had hoped for without fully expecting to find. "Irene," he said. Something just changed. She was in his Columbus office 2 hours later, Violet beside her, both of them still in their coats. Nelson sat across the desk and laid it out in the careful, ordered way he did everything. No dramatizing, just the facts, placed one after another like stones across a river. The previous night, Violet had sent Major General Sasha Tolbert a package of documents. Physical documents, not digital. Decades-old records kept in the meticulous, systematic way of a woman who had spent 6 years as a senior military medical officer and understood that documentation was not administrative habit, but survival strategy. Violet had maintained these records through every house move, every life change, every year that passed in which they seemed to have no particular purpose. Among those documents was a copy of the Grover Falls Police Department's 2019 federal grant application. 47 pages, signed on the final page by Chief Vincent Orchard in his official capacity. The application sought renewal of a substantial federal law enforcement operating grant, the same grant that had been funding a significant portion of the department's budget for 11 years. The application contained a mandatory certification section. Orchard had signed it. The certification stated, under penalty of federal law, that the Grover Falls Police Department was in full compliance with ADA Title II requirements, had no unresolved civil rights complaints within the preceding 5 years, and had no pending or ongoing investigations into officer misconduct. At the time Orchard signed that certification, there were 3 active internal complaints against Officer Trainum sitting in department files. All 3 were being actively suppressed under Orchard's direct orders. One of them was Lucia Vash's. Orchard had signed a federal document swearing they didn't exist. Filing a false certification on a federal grant application, Nelson said, is federal fraud. Title 18, United States Code. He paused. That is not a civil matter. That is not something a state court TRO can touch. That is not something the police union's attorneys can file an injunction against. He looked at both of them across the desk. That is a federal criminal matter, and General Tolbert's office does not handle it directly. But she knows precisely who does. Major General Tolbert had coordinated with 2 agencies. The first was the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, which had already been peripherally aware of Nelson's federal complaint. Tolbert's documentation gave them what they needed to move from peripheral awareness to active investigation. The second was the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, which handled exactly the kind of case that a police chief committing federal grant fraud while orchestrating a civil rights suppression campaign represented. Federal search warrants were executed at Grover Falls Police Department headquarters on a Thursday morning, 8 days after Violet mailed the package. Irene learned about it the way most of Grover Falls did, through a local news alert on her phone at 7:42 in the morning. The alert said only that federal agents were present at the department and that the nature of the operation was not yet known. She sat at the kitchen table and read the alert 3 times. Then she called Nelson. "I know," he said, before she spoke. "I'm watching the same feed." That same Thursday afternoon, Sergeant Yvonne Quill walked into the FBI field office in Columbus. She had her private file with her, the one she had maintained for 2 years, the one she had never been able to use inside a system designed to protect the people she was documenting. She sat down with 2 federal investigators and gave a sworn statement that lasted 90 minutes. She named every individual in the suppression chain. She provided dates, document numbers, direct quotes from conversations she had written down the same day they occurred. She was clear. She was documented. She did not waver once. When it was over, she walked out of the building into the afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the cold air. 2 years of waiting. It had been worth it. Back in Nelson's office, he looked at Irene across the desk and said the words she had needed to hear for 4 months. "The TRO cannot touch a federal criminal investigation," he said. "It's over for them. They just don't know it yet." Across town, at that exact moment, Chief Vincent Orchard's phone began to ring. He did not answer. The following Monday morning, the Grover Falls City Council held an emergency session. Irene watched it on her laptop at the kitchen table, the stream choppy but clear enough. 7 council members seated in a row behind a long table, expressions ranging from grim to carefully neutral. The chamber was full. Standing room only. Community members packed the public gallery, some of them people Irene recognized from the courthouse steps in Columbus, some of them faces she had never seen before, but who had clearly been waiting a long time for exactly this morning. The session lasted 22 minutes. At the end of it, Chief Vincent Orchard was placed on unpaid administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a federal criminal investigation into grant fraud and civil rights obstruction. The vote was 6-1. The single dissenting vote belonged to a council member who represented Orchard's district and who would, Nelson noted in a text to Irene during the session, be facing his own uncomfortable questions before long. An hour later, a photographer outside the Grover Falls Police Department captured the image that would run on every local news outlet by afternoon. Vincent Orchard walking out of the building he had run for 11 years carrying a cardboard box. Gray suit. No hat. His attorney walked beside him, talking in a low, urgent voice that Orchard appeared not to be listening to. He looked straight ahead. His face was composed in the careful blankness of a man concentrating very hard on not showing what he was actually feeling. He looked smaller than his uniform. Irene looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about his press conference, the practiced sympathy, the word isolated, used twice in 4 sentences, deployed with the ease of a man who had used it many times before and expected to use it many times again. She thought about his lunch with Trainum outside City Hall, the hand on the shoulder, the easy laughter of men who believed they were untouchable. She set her phone down and picked up her pencil. 48 hours after the council session, the Ohio State Court TRO was vacated. Judge Randy Casper dissolved it without a hearing, without a written opinion, without any of the procedural ceremony that had attended its creation. His clerk filed a single-paragraph order on a Wednesday afternoon. Once federal criminal proceedings were confirmed and active, the state injunction had nowhere left to stand. Federal jurisdiction was not a question the state court wanted to argue. Nelson called Irene the moment the order hit the docket. "It's gone," he said. 3 words. She had been waiting for them for weeks. The federal civil rights case was immediately restored to full active status. It now ran in parallel with the criminal investigation. 2 separate tracks, both moving, both pointed in the same direction. Nelson filed an amended complaint that same afternoon, incorporating the grant fraud evidence and Orchard's personal liability in language that left nothing ambiguous. The terminations came the following morning. Officers Nigel Trainum and Brent Hank were formally separated from the Grover Falls Police Department, effective immediately. Not suspended, not transferred, not placed on leave. Terminated. Their department credentials were deactivated. Their access to department systems was revoked. Their service weapons were surrendered. The police union filed its automatic grievance within the hour. It was reflex more than strategy. the contractual response to any termination, filed before the ink was dry. But the union's own lead attorney, in a private call to the city that Nelson learned about through a source in the city solicitor's office, advised quietly that the criminal exposure made the grievance legally untenable. Defending officers under active federal indictment using member dues, in a case this public and this documented, was not a fight the union's leadership had any appetite for. The grievance sat on file. Nobody pressed it forward. The federal indictment of Nigel Tranum arrived on a Friday. 2 counts: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct a civil rights investigation. The document was public record, available to anyone who looked for it, written in the plain declarative language of federal legal proceedings that left no room for interpretation or spin. Hank had cooperated. His statement, provided to federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges, confirmed what Irene had suspected since the morning it happened. There had been no call about a theft in progress. There had been no report of a suspicious individual matching her description. Tranum had seen Irene through the diner window from the parking lot before they even entered the building. He had seen her wheelchair. He had made a decision. He had walked in looking for her specifically. Nelson sent Irene the indictment document as a PDF. She opened it at her desk and read it straight through without stopping. When she reached Hank's statement, the part that confirmed the fabricated call, the deliberate targeting, the premeditation of all of it, she stopped. She read that section again. He saw the placard. She said quietly, "To no one." He knew. The room was very still around her. She set the document down on the desk beside her Meridian sketches. The indictment and the engineering drawings, side by side, 2 different kinds of work aimed at 2 different kinds of justice, and sat with the weight of it for a long, quiet moment. Then she picked up her pencil and got back to work. Thomas Wren knocked on Violet's front door at 9 in the morning. No call ahead, no text. Just a knock. And when Violet opened the door, he was standing on the porch in a plain jacket, hat in both hands, turning it slowly the way people turn things when they don't know what to do with their hands. He looked like a man who had made a decision and arrived before he could talk himself out of it. Violet looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table across from Irene, hat on the table beside him, hands folded in front of him. No cameras, no journalists waiting outside, no carefully prepared statement with language reviewed by an attorney. Just a man in a kitchen, looking at a girl he had failed, trying to find the beginning of an honest sentence. Irene waited. "I was scared," Wren said finally. His voice was rough, like the words had been sitting in his chest for weeks and had worn the edges off his throat on the way out. They came around, city inspector, couple of guys I'd never seen before, asking questions about my kitchen ventilation, my fire exits, my liquor license. Little things. Nothing they could actually close me on, but enough to make it clear that... He stopped, looked at his hands. They didn't have to say it directly. I understood. Irene said nothing. "I've owned that diner for 19 years, he continued. "I built it myself. My father worked in a diner his whole life and never owned a square foot of it. And I..." He stopped again. "That's not an excuse. I know that. I'm not telling you so you'll excuse it." He looked up at her. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know it wasn't nothing to me." Standing there and saying nothing. It wasn't nothing. The kitchen was quiet. Irene looked at him steadily. She thought about the dish towel, the way he had stood behind that counter with it in both hands, and watched Trainum lean into her wheelchair space and said absolutely nothing. She thought about the statement he had issued afterward, the careful, bloodless language, the full confidence in the department, the erasure of everything he had witnessed with his own eyes. She reached across the table and picked up one of Nelson's business cards from the small stack she kept near the fruit bowl. She held it out. "My attorney will be in touch," she said. "He'll need your official witness statement. Everything you saw. All of it." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Wren took the card. He looked at it for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." He left 20 minutes later. Violet closed the door behind him and came back to the kitchen. She didn't say anything about it. She put the kettle on. That same afternoon, Councilwoman Fay Birchwood stood at a podium outside City Hall in her good blue blazer and announced the introduction of a sweeping municipal ordinance. Mandatory body cameras for all Grover Falls officers, active at all times during any public interaction, with footage retained for a minimum of 3 years. An independent civilian review board, appointed by community election rather than mayoral appointment, with full subpoena power and the authority to recommend termination without requiring a criminal conviction. She spoke for 11 minutes. She used the word accountability 7 times. She did not mention that she had spent the better part of 3 months saying nothing, filing nothing, doing nothing while the legal machinery ground forward without her. A reporter asked Irene about Birchwood's announcement at her own press appearance outside Nelson's office an hour later. Irene considered the question for a moment. The people of Grover Falls deserve accountability that exists whether or not it's politically convenient, she said. She didn't look away from the camera when she said it. The reporter pressed, "Is that a yes or a no on Councilwoman Birchwood?" "It's an answer," Irene said simply. The call from Langford University came at 6:15 that evening. Irene was in the kitchen helping Violet with dinner when her phone rang. A Columbus area code she didn't recognize. She answered it standing at the counter, a dish towel over one shoulder, completely unprepared for what came next. The university president introduced himself. He did not have his communications director on the line. He did not read from a prepared statement. He spoke in the direct, slightly formal way of a man who understood that some conversations required him personally and could not be delegated. The rescission was improper. It was fully reversed, effective immediately. Her acceptance to the School of Engineering stood without condition. Furthermore, the university was offering Irene a full 4-year merit scholarship. He cited her demonstrated character. He cited the university's obligation to correct what he carefully described as an administrative failure that did not reflect the institution's values. He said he was sorry. He said it like he meant it. Irene listened to all of it without interrupting. She thanked him. She said she looked forward to starting in the fall. Violet was at the stove with her back turned, stirring something, and she had heard every word of it through the small kitchen. She did not turn around. Her shoulders had changed, though. Something released in them. Something that had been held tight for months. Neither of them spoke. The kitchen smelled like dinner. Outside the window, the evening was going dark and quiet over Grover Falls, ordinary and unhurried, the same as any other Thursday. Irene set her phone down on the counter. She picked up the dish towel and went back to helping with dinner. The morning after the call, Irene woke early. Not the sleepless, hollow early of the past 3 months. The 2 a.m. Ceiling staring, the quiet dread, the weight of everything unresolved pressing down on the dark. This was different. This was the kind of early that felt like the beginning of something rather than the middle of something hard. She transferred into her wheelchair, pulled on a sweatshirt, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. The house was still. The acceptance letter sat in its frame on the counter, exactly where it had been sitting for weeks, unhung, waiting. Irene looked at it for a long moment. She picked it up. The frame was simple. Dark wood, clean lines, the kind of frame you bought because it suited the thing inside it, rather than calling attention to itself. Violet had bought it 2 years ago, before the applications were even submitted, and had set it on the counter without explaining why. She hadn't needed to explain. Irene had understood. She turned it over in her hands. The coffee-stained letter, the soft fold lines, the creased corner from the day it had lived in her backpack through everything. The Langford seal, still sharp and clear despite all of it. She had carried this piece of paper through the worst months of her life, and it had held together. It had not fallen apart. Neither had she. She found the hammer in the kitchen drawer where Violet kept it. She measured the wall across from the table with her eye, the wall she looked at every morning over breakfast, the wall that currently held nothing but a faded watercolor of a garden that had been there since before Irene was born. She hung the frame. She wheeled back to the table and looked at it from there. It was exactly right. The gathering outside Millhaven Diner happened 1 week later on a Saturday afternoon. Irene hadn't planned it. She hadn't asked for it. Someone in the community had organized it. She still wasn't entirely sure who, and the invitation had reached her through Dory, who had texted her 3 days before with a screenshot and a single message. "You have to come." She almost didn't go. Not because she was afraid of the crowd or the cameras, but because she was tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with sleep. The deep tired of someone who had been fighting at full force for months and was only now beginning to feel the cost of it in her bones. Violet sat across from her at the kitchen table the evening before and said only, "They came out for you when it was cold and uncertain. Go." Irene went. The parking lot was full. Not just community members, though there were many of them. People she recognized and people she didn't, bundled against the October chill with hand-lettered signs and the particular energy of a crowd that had come not to protest, but to celebrate something that had actually been won. Disability rights advocates, local journalists, 2 women who had driven from Columbus because they had followed the story from the beginning and wanted to see the ending in person. Dory found her immediately at the edge of the crowd, phone already up, already filming, grinning the way she grinned when she was trying not to cry. She pulled Irene into a hug that lasted longer than either of them would have predicted. Nelson was near the back of the crowd, standing slightly apart in his good coat, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a man who won things professionally and had not yet learned to show it extravagantly. He caught Irene's eye and nodded once. Sergeant Yvonne Quill was there too, near the back, in civilian clothes, standing alone. She wasn't there officially. She was there as a person who had waited 2 years to see a particular morning arrive, and had decided she was allowed to witness it. Irene crossed to her specifically, through the crowd, and shook her hand. Quill looked at her with those still, watchful eyes and said, "You held up." "We both did," Irene said. Major General Sasha Tolbert was standing beside Violet near the diner entrance. She was in civilian clothes, dark coat, no insignia, nothing to announce her. And she was shorter than Irene had imagined from the weight her name carried in every conversation. She and Violet stood side by side the way old friends stand, not needing to perform their closeness for anyone, simply present in it. Tolbert looked at Irene the way people look at someone they have heard a great deal about, and are now measuring against the reality. "Your grandmother tells me you want to build mobility aids that change people's lives," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Irene said. Tolbert nodded slowly. "Good. The world needs people who know what it costs to be ignored." A beat. "And build anyway." Irene looked at her, then at Violet, who was watching her granddaughter with an expression she didn't try to hide. The particular, uncomplicated pride of someone who had known all along. Across the parking lot, Dory had found a better angle and was filming again, phone held steady, catching everything. She caught Irene's eye across 30 feet of crowd and people and autumn light. Irene laughed. Unguarded, sudden, entirely real. The laugh of someone who had forgotten for 3 months what it felt like to have nothing left to brace against. She was 18 years old. She was going to college in 3 weeks. The accessible parking sign gleamed in the afternoon light, clean and bright, at the edge of the lot where her van was parked, right where it belonged. The story ends here. Not quietly, not slowly, not with a long look backward at everything it cost. It ends the way the best things end, at the peak, in the light, with a young woman who refused to move along, surrounded by every person who had refused to let her stand alone, laughing in the exact spot where someone had once looked down at her and decided she didn't matter. He had been wrong. She always had. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.